Hello people, how are you doing? Welcome, my name is Adam. This is Memento Mori. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're having a good summer. I've been having such a good summer, man. It's been so nice here, and being somebody who lives in a climate where it is gray and overcast for 8 or 9 months out of the year, I do truly appreciate this small window of summer that we get here. So yeah, when the sun's out, I'm worshiping it. Okay? Recently I was in Hawaii for a week and it was gorgeous there. I was on Oahu and then came back and it's still glorious here. So yeah, I'm just riding out these last weeks of summer and I hope whichever season it may be where you're at, things are going well. So nice to sit down with you, and I feel like I haven't just rambled on about books in a while, so I thought I would do so today. I'm going to do something called Choose the Year, okay? This was created by Mel. She has a channel called Mel's Bookland Adventures. I'll link it down below. And I think Mel had a handful of prompts that went along with this, which I'm not necessarily going to do, but I think I cover them all as I work through this video. But the premise really is very simple. The idea is to choose a year and then to talk about books published within that year. And they can be books, that you've read or haven't read, ones that you want to read, or maybe even books that you have no interest in reading. So yeah, I think it's really great, and like most people, I am picking my birth year, which for me is 1983, okay? I was born on January 29th, 1983. Yeah, I kind of broke this up into categories. Excuse me as I look down at my notes. So yeah, we're gonna go just down this list somewhat chronologically, but before that, I thought I would mention the author of 1983, and arguably the author of the 80s period, which is Stephen King. In 1983, Stephen King published 3 novels, none of which I've read. The first being The Biggest Pet Cemetery, and then he had Christine, which was about the car, right? The possessed car. And then something called Cycle of the Werewolf, which I know nothing about. I've never been like a Stephen King guy. In high school, I read It, and I read Misery, okay? And I feel like that's good. I feel like that's enough. Yeah, I've never had great interest. Never say never. I could picture maybe one day picking up like The Shining or something, but he's definitely not an author I have interest, diving into. But certainly he was a force in the 80s and continues to be so, up until today. So he's worth mentioning, Stephen King. And then we're going to kind of move chronologically through this. I'm going to mention a couple books in each of these categories, just for the sake of time, starting with children's literature, okay? Children's literature, which is scary for me because, I've worked very hard in blocking out my childhood. And this is something I've been working a lot on with my therapist, at Just One Reader. And usually you're supposed to open those doors and face your childhood face on, the trauma and whatnot. But very early on, Juan and I both agreed that it's probably best in my case just to completely seal it off. So it's for that reason, I don't remember a lot of the books I read, but a couple of these look familiar. The main one being the Berenstain Bears, okay? Hold my hand. They had a couple books published in 1983, and I had a million of those Berenstain Bears books. I remember nothing about them. I know it was a family of bears that lived in a house. I'm assuming by the name that they were Jewish. Maybe that's where my love of Philip Roth novels stems from, I don't know. But the Berenstain Bears was big in 1983. And then the other one that really stood out was The Witches by Roald Dahl, which I don't think I ever read. I know a lot of you were really into Roald Dahl as children. Some continue to be so as adults, which is weird. But yeah, The Witches, I don't think I read that one. I just wasn't really into him, though I do remember really liking the one. There was one about a child that lived in this giant peach. Very strange. I remember distinctively thinking that there was something very sexual about this peach. And this is, long before the whole Call Me By Your Name fiasco with the peach. But yeah, I remember thinking, I don't know, maybe there was something vaginal about a peach. maybe something womb-like with this child living in there with all these creatures. I don't know, but yeah, Roald Dahl, The Witches, didn't read that one, but that was 1983. A little bit further, this I guess would be considered like middle grade for me, into the genre of fantasy, okay? The 80s saw a huge influx of fantasy novels being published, and a subgenre of that, I guess you'd call it like humor fantasy. A couple big ones published in 1983. The main one being The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, which I actually just reread earlier this year. Yeah, I loved this as a kid, and this was the first book in his Discworld series, which would go on to have just 1 million novels. So that was a big one, published in 83. And then another one, a big one, is On a Pale Horse by Piers, which is more kind of modern fantasy, also in 83. Going through the list, of course, there was a ton of fantasy on there. The one that really stood out was one called Magician's Gambit, okay, by David Eddings. And I was so into this, man. This is the third book in a series that was called The Belgariad by David Eddings. And I remember discovering it within my middle school library and just devouring it. I think there was 5 books in total. And yeah, I was all about it. And it's kind of sad because probably like 5 or 6 years ago, I thought I would tap back into my childhood. Again, a big mistake. That I would tap into it and reread the series and kind of relive that. And I bought like an omnibus that contained the first 3 novels in it. And it was horrible. It was a horrible, man. I think I actually made it to Magician's Gambit before giving up. Because, yeah, you know, the 80s, there was a large amount of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings knockoffs. And this is definitely one of them, and not one of the best. It's, you know, about a young boy who grows up poor on a farm, and then one day he discovers that he has this famous lineage and that he's the chosen one, and there's an evil god that lives to the east in a tower, and instead of a missing ring, there's a missing orb, and this young boy and his fellowship of eccentric characters you know, have to go find it. So yeah, that was something that was probably best left to my childhood, but Little Adam was all about it. Was all about it. And then again, time-wise, in terms of when I would be into this, again, would be kind of middle grade, middle school years. And a lot of people might be surprised that I actually own this, but this is the Dark Phoenix Saga. Part of the storyline within the X-Men comics, okay? We're going into comic books here. Time-wise, I'm a little iffy on this because 83, the Dark Phoenix Saga was a storyline that ran in monthly issues of the X-Men comic on and off from the late 70s into the early 80s. So I don't know if 1983 was the year that it just finally ended or the year that it was first published altogether. But yeah, it ran for a long time, but it's listed under 83, so we're gonna go with it. And you know, I was not a huge comic book reader as a kid, but I was really into the X-Men. And again, this was mid-90s, kind of the peak of their popularity. They had the comic books, they had the cartoon and the action figures and the trading cards and all of that. And I was all about it. And you know, I talked about with David Eddings how that was something best left, you know, in my childhood. But with something like this, it's actually the opposite, because as a kid, I did have a lot of the X-Men comics, but I didn't necessarily follow the storylines. I was more just interested in the art and the characters themselves, rather than these storylines. Again, this is kind of at the peak of their popularity, and every month they would have like 10 different X-Men titles coming out. So they'd have different teams, and oftentimes the storylines would cross over. And there's no way, even if I wanted to as a kid, that I could have kept up with it all. So again, I was more just into the art. So it's really nice as an adult to be able to revisit that and kind of appreciate those complex storylines, especially with something like the Dark Phoenix Saga. Because if you would have handed this to me when I was a kid back then, I probably would have thought it was sort of lame. Because again, this is from late 70s, early 80s, which aesthetic-wise was very different from the 90s, okay? The 90s, in terms of comics and you know, all around, everything was about being big, right? Like, the hair was big, the muscles were big, both the, you know, male and female characters had tits out to here, okay, and the costumes were elaborate and all that. So comparatively, I would have thought something like the Dark Phoenix Saga and its art was kind of subdued. Again, that's coming more out of the vein of coming out of the Golden Age into what it was. So it's really nice to be able to appreciate both the story and art of those older books. And I will say, I don't think I could ever picture myself as an adult like getting into comic books or like the X-Men today, but it is nice to revisit those old storylines. And the Dark Phoenix Saga is probably the most famous X-Men storyline. It's about this character, Jean Grey, okay, and she has telekinetic powers, and she goes up to space with the X-Men, her team, and while there she becomes possessed by an alien entity called the Phoenix Force, okay, and then she dies, and she's reborn with all these added powers. And then, as the title suggests, you know, later on she turns evil and becomes the Dark Phoenix. So it's a whole thing. But yeah, that's my dirty secret of being a past comic book fan. So through with that. And then just moving into adulthood, there was quite a few on there I was surprised that I have read, but I thought I would just mention a couple. The main book that stood out, of course, was Cathedral by Raymond Carver. You know, very fitting that this book was published as, you know, Adam was brought into the world, okay? I love Raymond Carver. Cathedral is his third and final kind of full collection of short stories. And it's most well known for being written after Carver had a long battle with alcoholism, and he finally achieved sobriety. And this collection is well known for stories that are maybe a little bit more hopeful than the ones from his previous collections, which obviously played into his, you know, sobriety. And yeah, I love all three of his collections. I love Carver. So yeah, 1983, big year. And then a huge book in my life, man, and one I remember talking about this very early on in my channel, but this is Hitchcock by Francois Truffaut. Just an incredible piece of work. It is a transcript of an interview that Truffaut conducted with Alfred Hitchcock over the span of a few days, where they chronologically go through every one of Hitchcock's film and do kind of a deep dive into each film. And again, this was conducted in the early 80s, so it was quite late in Hitchcock's life and career, so it pretty much spans his entire filmography. It is the book related to Hitchcock, if you're a fan, that you have to read. Or if you're even just a fan of filmmaking in general, you will learn so much from this book. There's the two guys. It's glorious. And you know, I think a lot of people don't realize that back in Hitchcock's time, he was not viewed as this, you know, master director, this auteur, this artistic auteur that he is today. He was viewed as a very popular director, you know, a director of popular suspense films, and obviously a huge celebrity, but again, not this real artist that we view him as today. And it really wasn't until kind of the late 50s into the early 60s and beyond where there was this huge art house movement coming out of Europe, primarily that of the French New Wave. And you had all of these young directors that were coming out who were viewed as, you know, these auteurs, and many of them saying what an influence Hitchcock and his American films were to them. And kind of spearheading that was Truffaut, who, you know, is arguably the face, you know, of the French New Wave, probably alongside Godard. But yeah, and he definitely, out of them all, was the Hitchcock fan, and he worked many years to land this interview, because Hitchcock, even though I think Hitchcock really liked being a celebrity, you know, he had a cameo in every one of his films, he had his television show, he liked being in front of the camera. He also was quite private in terms of, you know, he didn't give many interviews and didn't give a lot of details about his personal life. So it took Truffaut a long time to land this interview. And yeah, man, you know, Hitchcock to me is still like the ultimate comfort food in terms of film. So I love watching his stuff still and referencing back to this book, you know, on each individual film as I watch them. So yeah, I love this book. And then finally, I briefly wanted to mention a couple books that I have not read, but that I'd like to, that were published in '83. And there was quite a few, but again, I thought I would stick to the two books that I actually own physical copies of. The first one published in '83 is The Little Drummer Girl by John le Carre. If you've been watching my channel, you'd know that 2019 has been the year of le Carre, as I've kind of been working my way through his Smiley novels. The Little Drummer Girl is one of his standalones, one of his more popular ones, and most notable for the aspect that I believe it's the only novel he wrote that has a female as its lead protagonist. So it's for that reason alone that I'm looking forward to getting to The Little Drummer Girl. And then finally, man, it's criminal that I haven't read this. And you know, I'm not someone that feels bad about not reading certain books, but this is one, man, I should have ticked off my list by now, which is David James Duncan, The River Why, published in '83. And, you know, a contemporary American classic, which I guess I don't know if that title's fair, because I don't know if people are still reading Duncan, sadly. But you know, it's a book that I've always wanted to read. It's a Pacific Northwest author. It takes place, I think, in rural Oregon. It's a family drama. It's about fly fishing and nature and all these things that kind of tick boxes for me in terms of fiction that I'm drawn to. So yeah, I'm going to pull this out and keep it out as a reminder to get through it to the end of the year. But a book published in '83 that I want to get to. So that's it. Again, there was a lot of other books that I either have read or recognize on the list, but I wanted to keep it simple. You can do this yourself. I'll leave the link. I used Goodreads, where you can find a list of the books kind of listed in most popular order. And you can put in any date and do this yourself. And the great thing is that you can do this multiple times. There was a few dates that I was kind of debating between doing, so maybe in the future I'll do it again, because it is a nice way, even though it's all from one year, it pulls a nice variety of books, right, to kind of chat about. So it's been nice sitting down with you. I hope everything is going well, and I will talk to you soon.